Thank you very much, Natasha. I'm sure you feel really relieved having completed this project. Do you have any questions to ask, Natasha?
Yes, I'm wondering how often you came across examples in the, what is loosely termed the non-Western world, of people dealing with the crisis by minimising.
Okay.
I was just wondering how often you actually came across that in the literature where people would go, let's admit it, but make it seem really tiny.
I would say that's a typical Western approach as well. Like Vicky said, we'll fix it quickly. No, I think it's kind of the whole problem is that crisis management and crisis communication research is still really dominated by Western researchers. So you don't find really a lot about, for example, crisis in Asian countries. And then again, you can't generalize because something happens in an Asian country, for example in China, and is handled in a specific way. It doesn't mean it would work in Japan as well. And what was really interesting was what literature as well as one of the practitioners stated is you don't have to look that far. You don't have to look to other countries. So for example, Asian countries or whatever, because most of the countries are nowadays so international because they have so many international people living in one country that it's rather important to look at a segmentation in a country. So, for example, a person with Asian background might react differently to specific crisis communication than a person with New Zealand European background. So that's another thing. Or what, for example, one of the New Zealand practitioners said, it's not only the segmentation. It's as well. So, for example, if you are outside of Auckland, in rural areas of New Zealand, if there is a flood, then there is a flood. People are used to floods. They just deal with it. Whereas there would be panic somewhere else because people are just not used to it and they handle situations like these differently. But then it might be a country where people are just used to governments not reacting at all, like, for example, in some of the Asian countries where they rather don't admit anything.
Perhaps the best example of the one being the Japanese authorities and the threat of the nuclear meltdown. Yesterday there seemed to be, at least officially, playing down with seriousness. Is that a good example?
And and it is quite interesting if you look at different kind of media, so how they report about the incident. So it's kind of I looked at the whole thing. I looked at German media, and I said, "Oh my God, let's kind of leave Japan as soon as possible." It's kind of as if you look at other media. I think it wasn't a US report. I can't remember. They said, yeah, it's bad, but it's kind of the Japanese government does what they can. They have experts flying in and all the stuff. That still doesn't change the facts. But it's kind of, if you look then at the pictures and you get statements from government officials, you think, okay, it's kind of you can't really believe it. But it's kind of, then again, it's a cultural thing. It would be interesting to see how people react really if the government would really state the facts and say, okay, it's really that bad. For example, in Asian cultures, the whole not losing face thing is really, really important. So where you as a US American, for example, could state, okay, didn't go well, it's really, really bad. You couldn't do that, for example, in Japan because you would lose face and no one would respect you anymore. And it has a completely different, they value the whole face issue a lot more than, for example, in European culture.
Perhaps the organisation places an emphasis on ethical conduct, or the culture plays a greater role, the national or...
That was one of the things mentioned when I asked them for future research. A lot of them said they would like to see more research done in terms of ethics. But what they said on the other side is kind of that, for example, organizations nowadays just don't have a choice anymore because of the internet. They said it's kind of, you don't even have time to turn around and it's already on the internet what happens. So it's kind of ethical responsibility plays a big part in that, because they said that organizations nowadays are a lot quicker to admit they did something wrong and to recompensate for the damage, whereas it wasn't like that in earlier times, but then it was easier to hide something. So nowadays you just can't do it, and a lot of organizations just have to take the responsibility.
A couple of comments. How big is that gap between academia, academic work, and practitioners? Because academia is always reflective. It doesn't. It's not media reporting on the spot what's happening. It always takes some time to observe reality and analyze it. So, is that big that is noticeable, or is it a natural gap? Let's say
It's huge. But one of the practitioners said it's kind of the first thing they have to do if they get people fresh from uni. They have to teach them how to do it, because he said that all the different models and theories you learn at uni don't have anything to do with their real work. He said you can't apply a linear crisis development model to real crisis, because the crisis just spins out of control, and it seems really like. Well, it's kind of, you must say with the big public relation agencies, the international ones, they have their own researchers. So I think they are not that far from academia as the public relation practitioners in the smaller. And one of them said it's also talent, and you can't teach talent.
just a methodological question, Natasha. The first part of your methodology was basically a meta-analysis. But did you see it as such?
Xiong and Ihui, they named it meta-analysis, but as I looked at the contents of the articles, I used it as a content analysis, because I really went through and counted, for example, theories mentioned. So I did a content analysis.
There was a certain level of meta-analysis there.
But it's kind of, because in the beginning I tried to look it up. What is the difference between meta-analysis and content analysis? And it's a gray area depending on how you do it. It's
because you're comparing a big body of knowledge over a period of time, identifying certain trends.
But because I've looked at specific articles, and I went through the articles and I named it content analysis, because that's what I did, and it's kind of when I used the guidelines for content analysis to do my research project.
Just one observation, I'm really interested in that divide between academic and practical, and it would be interesting for somebody to do further research in that area. It seems to me that the kind of people who would gravitate towards, let's say, doing research in reputation management, public relations, and crisis communication and so on, are people who've been trained in a critical tradition. But people who are practitioners aren't looking for that. They're really looking for some way that they can carry out their work. And so I can understand why they would have that focus on case studies, which is basically a business school kind of approach, Harvard Business School kind of approach, is to have case studies because they can actually workshop them. And that, in answer to what Josh was saying, is that that's the way that you can actually help people develop experience in an academic context.
The other years of work experience, they've been mostly already 30 years and more in the business, and I wondered if it's maybe just, if at that time when they started the business, it just wasn't like that you had an academic background, or maybe you had it, but it wasn't as important. Because, for example, I've studied journalism and public relations. And I did heaps of internships in at different media stations. A lot of the people there, the old ones, they had learned the whole business. They haven't studied it, they learned it. So, and I know the one graduate, was a graduate event where people from businesses were there. I've talked to one, Alan something, I can't remember, from a PR agency.
No.
Yeah, and he said he doesn't have an academic degree because he learned the business. So it's kind of, it could be, and he's been already, as well, it's kind of ages in that business. So it might be that the new people coming in, they could have a completely different approach and they might value academic research more.
I think that might be the trend we're going to see, because more practitioners are coming from academic training.
Because it's kind of, especially I think public relations is a quite young discipline. I don't know if you were able to study public relations 30 years ago. It seemed to me that these practitioners at least valued the internal education at their organization a lot more than the academic background of employees. So yeah, it's interesting, but it's now I remember. Didn't you tell me, Ed, that there was a big conference in Wellington regarding the gap between public relations practice and theory? I know it was a while before I handed it in. You said, I know you mentioned it. I'm not sure if it was a Prince conference, but I know you mentioned something that there was a conference regarding exactly that topic. So
yeah, but looking just at the gender demographics there, we can see clearly this is the old guard of the profession. It's male, masculine profession. It's a male dominant old guard, and soon they are going to be replaced. And there will be a lot more women with university education, so perhaps we might be seeing a radical change in the way things are done in the profession.
For example, the only female, she had her own agency, so she was top level of her own agency. And with the Australian ones, it was quite interesting because they had some kind of triangle. There were three big international agencies, and it's kind of the lady worked for one before, the other one worked for the other one before. So it's kind of became all out of the same companies and organizations. So it's the question. For example, if the female would have been a managing director in another company. But I don't have to say the CEO of this company was female. So it's kind of, this was only the person who was specialized in crisis communication. So there seems to be there are females around.
There are.
It's really, if you look at the years of their experience, they've been around quite a while, and it seems like, especially these guys here, they don't need to have other sources for their work, because it's kind of, I had the impression they just do it like that. And they do good work.
And at that level, they have other people to do their thinking.
Any other questions?
Well, I'm just wondering, by interviewing your participants, did you kind of cross that one of them maybe had published something in a theoretical way, sharing their?
I honestly didn't ask them. I didn't think about that. I don't know, honestly. But it would have been interesting now that you said it.
I'm just wondering if they are just applying, if you think, in practice, or if they do think.
I know, for example, that these two ones, the New Zealand ones, they are giving seminars for Preds. So you can book crisis communication seminars, for example. So I think they must have published something somehow, but it's a lot of them are doing work for the Public Relations Institute, so doing further training for others. But I don't know if they ever published anything in academic journals. I asked them how often they get approached by academics, and they said occasionally, sometimes once a year. So it doesn't.
You would have come across any of their names in your searches of the international. If they had published anything,
yeah, they would have come up.
They would have come up in your searches, right?
Yeah, and kind of the only things I've seen were these two guys which were giving seminars for Prince.
Right, well, thank you very much.